In history classes throughout the Western world, students often come away with the impression that Hitler's Germany was the perfect totalitarian state. But as horrible and controlling as Nazi Germany was, many historians believe that the Soviet Union, particularly the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, was the most effective totalitarian state there has ever been. That's not to say that life in Hitler's Germany was a 24-hour-a-day party. Still, from the 1920s until 1953, the Soviets and Stalin created a pervasive and oppressive system that was the model for George Orwell's terrifying dystopian novel, 1984. In 1984, an agent of the government tells Winston Smith, the hero of the book, to imagine the future of mankind. When he can't, his interrogator tells him what it will be like.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
Welcome to the Soviet Union. For centuries, most Russians knew nothing but oppression. For most of that time, most Russians, even those in the cities, knew nothing about many progressive changes that had taken place in Western and Central Europe. So many had nothing to compare their plight to. However, with the coming of the 20th century and new methods of communication and travel, along with word of mouth, many Russians and other nationalities in the Russian Empire realized that there was a better way to live. For many people in the main cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, this meant some form of socialism or even communism. The Bolsheviks were one of those groups. And though they were first a minority among opposition groups in Russia, they were among the most organized, active, and effective. There were two Russian revolutions in 1917. The first was carried out by primarily moderate socialist forces in February and succeeded in overthrowing the Romanov dynasty of czars. However, the Bolsheviks and other more hardcore socialists, unhappy that the new government had not taken Russia out of the war, launched another revolution in October 1917, which removed the provisional government set up in February. They also took custody of Tsar Nicholas II and his family and, as you may know, executed them in July 1918. Though there had been assassination attempts on Nicholas and other Russian emperors, they had mainly been carried out by royal rivals. Nicholas was killed by members of a political party made up of workers, soldiers, farmers, and yes, some political agitators. The Bolshevik leader was Vladimir Lenin. And though today some people attempt to find some liberal Western traits in some of his writings and behavior, Lenin was ultimately a tyrant. Through his orders, millions lost their lives. Just not as many as would die under his successor Stalin, who is estimated to be responsible for the deaths of 20 million of his own people. The Bolsheviks controlled many of Western Russia's large cities, and a few in other parts of the country. Still, the forces of the Whites, men loyal to the Romanov family or Tsarist system, or in favor of a military government, controlled much of the country. In a brutal civil war in which there were atrocities on both sides, the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds because red represented socialism, excelled. And what's more, they didn't kill their white enemies. In places where the population wasn't sure, they wanted to support the Bolsheviks. Two things happened. People were sent to camps to learn their lesson, or shot. Most were shot. Many factories with their large freight elevators became death centers. People would go into an elevator, go up or down depending, get off, and get shot in the back of the head, while the empty elevator went back to get more victims. Don't get the wrong impression. The Bolsheviks could never have won without massive support. They promised a new and equal society based on the common welfare after centuries of Tsarist and aristocratic oppression. Yet in the countryside of Russia, Ukraine, and other areas, many people were serfs, slaves in all but name, with virtually no rights. To them, what the Bolsheviks promised seemed to be heaven on earth. There were many problems. Not everyone wanted socialism, for one. Second, the economy was in shambles, and the war severely damaged the country's western region. Third, the Bolsheviks were trying something no one had ever tried before. Lastly, many nations, including France, Britain, and the USA, did not want communism to succeed in Russia or anywhere else, and even sent troops to northern Russia to supply the whites. Lenin and his men, including the famous Leon Trotsky, founder of the Red Army and one of the party's leaders, and Stalin, a former seminary student turned bank robber and guerrilla fighter, felt they had enemies everywhere. So, during the war, the Cheka, the forerunner to all the communist secret police, the MVD, the NKVD, and the KGB, began a system of repression and terror unrivaled anywhere in the world at the time. Teachers, writers, poets, labor leaders, and anyone that spoke out against or even grumbled about the Bolsheviks, now called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union (CPSU), were suspected and were often jailed or killed based only on suspicion or denunciation by a foe or hated neighbor. No one knows how many people were killed during the Red Terror of 1918 to 1922, but 200,000 is often cited, and many historians think that's low. During Lenin's domination of the party, which ended with his death in early 1924, homosexuality, which had been against the law during the Tsarist times, was made legal. Though it was not done intentionally at this point in history, communist governments became very good at this tactic. Make something legal, then outlaw it when enough people have revealed themselves. The most famous instance of this happened in communist China in the early 1960s when Chairman Mao asked the country to let 100 flowers bloom, meaning that the party welcomed new ideas and criticisms to improve itself. When Mao decided he disliked being criticized, many people who wrote or spoke out were sent to camps or shot. Mostly shot, though Moscow and St. Petersburg were not like San Francisco, New York, Berlin, or any other sizable Western city today where people of all preferences mostly feel free to be themselves. Many gay men came out. Though it was now legal, people still noticed, including neighbors and the police. This issue was not as important regarding homosexual women, for they were not considered a threat to masculinity. Though communists had actually made several important strides regarding equal rights, men still ran the Soviet Union, and many of these officials believed gay men to be a threat. In 1933, under Stalin, Article 121 of the Penal Code was passed, making homosexuality a crime and punishable by 5 years in prison with hard labor. At the time, that was the same as a death sentence for most people, especially for gay men, who found themselves targets of the criminal population of the camps. The Russian Empire had always had work camps. The Soviets continued and expanded the work camp system. Gulag was the acronym for the Russian for Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps, which became a branch of the Soviet government in the late 1920s. One man, daring to question why he and others were sent out in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit weather to cut wood, was told, "The idea is to use you up, understand?" Then he was sent to a metal box on the tundra, not big enough to lay down or stand up, to think about his disobedience. The man was an American, and his name was Victor Herman. His father, a revolutionary who had to flee to America, brought his family back to his homeland to help build a socialist utopia. Instead, his son, who refused to sign a paper saying he was a Soviet citizen when he broke a world record for skydiving, spent most of his life in the Gulag, only being freed in the 1980s to return home to Michigan. Not all Gulag camps were in Siberia, but most were, and if you were lucky enough to be in a slightly warmer climate, that likely meant you worked in the mines, with very little, if any, safety equipment and no safety inspections. As a result, the bones of hundreds of thousands of men are likely still buried in collapsed mines all over the former territories of the Soviet Union. In one instance, a few thousand prisoners destined for the mines and hard labor of the Gulag were left on an island in the Ob River in western Siberia. They were only supposed to be there for a day at most until the regional authorities figured out what to do with them. They hadn't been told they were coming. On Nazino Island, 6,000 prisoners were left without food or clean water for days. People turned on each other. The few bags of flour left for the prisoners were eaten and mixed with dirty water, which caused dysentery. Over 3,500 people died. Many of the corpses had been eaten, and what's more, many people, usually women, had been killed specifically for food. No one is sure how many people died in the Gulag system during the Stalin years, but the lowest estimates are still in the millions. Stalin was power-mad and paranoid. It's how he stayed in power, because there were plenty of other power-mad and paranoid people ready to take his place. Beginning in the early 30s and increasing in frequency in 1937 and 1938, Stalin had many of his old communist comrades killed or arrested. Some of these men had been lauded as heroes and guiding forces of the revolution for years, and many appeared on posters and billboards with Stalin throughout the country. One of them was Sergei Kirov, the popular Communist Party head of Leningrad, which had been St. Petersburg and would be again after 1991. Kirov was seen by many as a rising star in the Communist Party, and he was exceedingly popular in his important hometown, the second city of Russia, and the home of the revolution. That meant that he would eventually be in Stalin's sights. But on December 1st, 1934, he was in the sights of a disgruntled Communist Party member and shot in his office. There has been speculation ever since that Stalin organized the killing, but it's as likely that the assassin acted alone over a long-standing grudge. Still, no one benefited from Kirov's death as much as Stalin did. Years before, he had forced the popular Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky to flee the country. This was convenient in many ways, for though Stalin fully intended to kill Trotsky and finally succeeded in 1940 when an NKVD assassin lodged an ice axe in Trotsky's skull, while Trotsky lived, Stalin had an outside enemy to blame all the ills of Soviet society on. According to Stalin and his political machine, Trotsky, in league with the Western powers, planned on overthrowing the government and, depending on what you read, planned to install capitalism in Russia, returning the Romanovs to power, break up the Soviet Union, and more. Everything was blamed on Trotsky, as was Kirov's death. And it wasn't just Kirov. By 1937, Stalin had had enough of some of the other powerful men of the Soviet Union. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev were friends and allies of Lenin, whom Stalin had always hated. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a hero of the civil war against the Whites, was popular and had many local men in the Red Army under his command. In truth, none of these men were actively plotting against Stalin, but he had them arrested anyways. They and everyone associated with them. He didn't stop there either. In 1937, he purged the Red Army Officer Corps. 90% of the top generals in the army were jailed, and most of those were killed. The percentage decreased as ranks got lower, but when Stalin went to war against Finland in 1939 and had to fight Hitler in 1941, his army was very short of officers who had any idea what they were doing. Most high-ranking men were brought before courtrooms filled with newsreel cameras, radio microphones, and foreign representatives. Almost everyone had been tortured with beatings with fists, truncheons, pipes, mock drownings, electrocution, and much more before signing a confession admitting that they were enemies of the state or Comrade Stalin. One bonus for the accused: if they confessed on paper and in front of the court, their families wouldn't be sent to the Gulag or shot in the basement of NKVD headquarters, as they were. Anyone with any sense knew the trials were a sham, but Stalin's hold on the secret police and all the other organs of the government was unbreakable, and no one dared speak out. Famous historian Orlando Figes has called the generations who grew up under Stalin the Whisperers, because no one dared speak aloud. Sometimes, even if what they said was completely innocent, it could be taken in the wrong way. The police and their informers were everywhere. In one famous account, a survivor of the Gulag wrote of a meeting of a man who told his friends of a dream he had where Stalin was doing bad things. He was arrested and sent to the camps for having an anti-Stalin dream. Yeah. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.